The West Memphis Three, Justice Derailed. In the twilight hours of May 5, 1993, the bodies of three 8-year-old boys, Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were discovered in a drainage ditch in Robin Hood Hills, West Memphis, Arkansas. What followed became one of the most controversial criminal cases in American judicial history, a stark reminder of how easily justice can be perverted when fear, prejudice, and tunnel vision contaminate an investigation. The bodies were found naked, hog-tied with their own shoelaces, bearing signs of brutal trauma. Christopher Byers had suffered genital mutilation. Initial medical examiner reports suggested the victims had been sexually assaulted, though this would later be contested. Water had washed away crucial evidence. Crime scene management was, by professional standards, abysmal. Investigators trampled potential evidence, failed to secure the perimeter properly, and neglected to collect items that may have held evidentiary value. What the scene showed was horrific. What investigators chose to see in it was something else entirely. West Memphis in 1993 was not merely a geographical location but a cultural timestamp, a community deeply entrenched in evangelical Christianity, where outsiders were viewed with suspicion. When juvenile officer Jerry Driver suggested the murders bore ritualistic elements, the investigation took a decisive and troubling turn. Rather than following physical evidence, detectives began hunting for suspects who fit their preconceived notion of who would commit such satanic acts. Enter Damien Echols, an 18-year-old high school dropout who wore black clothing, read books on Wicca and other occult subjects, and had been hospitalized for depression and suicidal ideation. In the eyes of local law enforcement, Echols was the embodiment of their satanic boogeyman. His close friend, Jason Baldwin, 16, and acquaintance Jesse Miskelly Jr., 17, were subsequently drawn into the investigation, not because of evidence linking them to the crime, but because of their association with Echols. The prosecution's case hinged almost entirely on a confession extracted from Jesse Miskelly Jr., a teenager with an IQ of 72, placing him near the threshold of intellectual disability. Detectives interrogated Miskelly for approximately 12 hours, but only 46 minutes were recorded. The unrecorded portions contained crucial context that would have revealed the coercive nature of the interrogation. The confession was riddled with factual inaccuracies. Miskelly initially stated the murders occurred in the morning, when the victims were verifiably in school, described ligatures that didn't match those found at the scene, and gave details about the crime that contradicted forensic evidence. Detectives fed him information throughout the questioning, a tactic known to produce false confessions, particularly among vulnerable individuals like Miskelly. Despite these red flags and despite Miskelly recanting his confession almost immediately, prosecutors used it to secure indictments against all three teenagers. In a particularly egregious violation of legal principles, prosecutors used Miskelly's confession to prejudice the jury pool against Echols and Baldwin, even though the confession was not admissible in their trial. The trials that followed were masterclasses in prosecutorial misconduct and judicial negligence. Despite having no physical evidence linking the defendants to the crime scene, no blood, no fingerprints, no DNA, prosecutors constructed a narrative of satanic ritual murder based on community rumors, jailhouse informants with questionable motives, and so-called expert testimony from individuals with dubious qualifications. Dale Griffiths, the prosecution's occult expert, testified that various elements of the crime scene indicated satanic ritual, despite having obtained his PhD from a non-accredited correspondence school and having no formal training in forensic science. The defense team, underfunded and outmatched, failed to effectively challenge this pseudo-scientific testimony. The prosecution presented black clothing, band t-shirts, and journal entries containing song lyrics as evidence of the defendant's satanic leanings. Echols' interest in Aleister Crowley and Stephen King novels was highlighted as proof of his capacity for violence. In essence, they were tried not for evidence linking them to murders, but for their nonconformity in a deeply conservative community. The jury, already contaminated by media coverage that had painted the teenagers as satanic killers before the trial even began, delivered guilty verdicts in both trials. Eccles received a death sentence, while Baldwin and Miskelly were sentenced to life imprisonment. Perhaps most damning to the prosecution's case was what wasn't presented at trial. Multiple witnesses provided alibis for the defendants that were either ignored or not thoroughly investigated. Forensic evidence at the scene suggested the murders likely took place elsewhere, with the bodies being transported to the drainage ditch after death, a feat that would have been physically challenging for 3 teenagers to accomplish without leaving evidence. Hair and fiber evidence collected at the scene did not match any of the defendants, but did match the stepfather of one victim. Blood evidence found at the scene was never properly tested against potential suspects. A knife recovered from a lake behind Baldwin's residence, dramatically presented by prosecutors as the potential murder weapon, was forensically determined to be unrelated to the wounds on the victims. Most crucially, DNA evidence recovered from the scene, when finally tested years later using advanced techniques, excluded Eccles, Baldwin, and Miskelly, while indicating the presence of unknown individuals. The West Memphis Three spent over 18 years in prison before emerging in 2011 through an unusual legal maneuver known as an Alford plea, allowing them to maintain their innocence while technically pleading guilty. This Faustian bargain secured their freedom but denied them true exoneration and prevented them from pursuing civil remedies against the state for wrongful imprisonment. The Alford plea represented a cynical calculation by Arkansas officials: release men who were likely innocent to avoid both the embarrassment of admitting a wrongful conviction and the financial liability of compensation for 18 stolen years. It was, in effect, a final injustice in a case defined by injustice, forcing innocent men to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit to escape punishment for crimes they didn't commit. While the West Memphis Three languished in prison, potentially viable suspects remained uninvestigated. Terry Hobbs, stepfather to victim Stevie Branch, had a history of domestic violence and provided inconsistent alibis. A hair consistent with his DNA was found in the ligatures used to bind the victims, evidence not available during the original trials. Multiple witnesses later came forward claiming Hobbs had been seen with the victims near the time of their disappearance, contradicting his initial statements to police. Another stepfather, John Mark Byers, initially drew suspicion for his erratic behavior following the murders and for gifting a knife to documentary filmmakers that appeared to have blood residue in its crevices. Though DNA testing would later exclude Byers as a contributor to genetic material found at the scene, the failure to thoroughly investigate these leads at the time of the original investigation represents a profound failure of justice. These alternative suspects were never properly investigated because investigators had already decided on their narrative. Satanic teenagers had committed ritual murder. Evidence that contradicted this theory was ignored, suppressed, or minimized. The role of media in the West Memphis Three case was paradoxical. Initial coverage largely echoed the prosecution's satanic panic narrative, helping to cement public perception of the defendant's guilt. However, the 1996 HBO documentary, Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, and its sequels, would ultimately prove instrumental in generating public skepticism about the convictions. Filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky originally traveled to Arkansas, intending to document the trials of 3 teenage satanic killers. What they found instead was a community gripped by hysteria and a justice system railroading 3 teenagers based on flimsy evidence and religious prejudice. Their documentary sparked national attention, eventually leading to advocacy by celebrities including Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and Peter Jackson. While this media attention ultimately helped secure the West Memphis Three's release, it came after nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment, years that no documentary, no celebrity advocacy, and no eventual freedom could restore. The tragedy of the West Memphis Three extends beyond the obvious miscarriage of justice. It represents a cascading failure of every safeguard in our criminal justice system. Police investigators abandoned objective evidence gathering in favor of confirming their predetermined theory. Prosecutors withheld exculpatory evidence and relied on junk science to secure convictions. Defense attorneys, underfunded and outmatched, failed to mount effective challenges to deeply flawed forensic testimony. Judges allowed prejudicial evidence and questionable expert witnesses to influence proceedings. The appellate system, designed to catch and correct such errors, instead reinforced them through procedural barriers and deference to lower courts. Most disturbingly, when confronted with mounting evidence of wrongful conviction, the system protected itself rather than seeking truth, offering freedom only in exchange for guilty pleas that would shield officials from accountability. Almost 3 decades after the murders, we still don't know with certainty who killed Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. What we do know is that 3 teenagers lost 18 years of their lives to imprisonment for crimes they almost certainly did not commit. We know that the real killers likely remained free. We know that 3 families of victims were denied true closure and justice. The West Memphis Three case stands as a stark reminder of how easily justice can be perverted when fear overwrites reason, when confirmation bias replaces investigation, and when the machinery of justice prioritizes convictions over truth. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how many other wrongful convictions might exist in cases that didn't receive HBO documentaries or celebrity advocacy. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the legal mechanisms that failed the West Memphis Three, coerced confessions, prosecutorial tunnel vision, junk science in courtrooms, inadequate defense resources, and overwhelming pressure to secure convictions, remain features, not bugs, in our criminal justice system. 3 boys died in those woods in West Memphis. 3 more lives were sacrificed at the altar of expedient justice. And the truth about what happened that May evening in 1993 remains elusive, not because it couldn't be found, but because those tasked with finding it were more interested in building a case than solving a crime. As Damien Echols himself observed after his release, "If they could do it to me, they could do it to anyone."